Good morning, everybody. This is another edition of the Passball Show brought to you by JohnPielli.com, by St. Aloysius Church and School in Jackson, New Jersey. Also by Two Ways, One Passion Food Truck located in Scranton, Pennsylvania. A handful of stuff we're going to go over today in the world of baseball, sports, and unifying America. We're going to play around with the show times. And I think at least for the next couple weeks, we're going to do a show every Thursday morning, every Saturday morning, at least for the next couple weeks. And, obviously from a breaking news standpoint, if something happens between Saturday and Thursday and I feel the need to, I'm chomping at the bit to get going and talk about something, we'll certainly bring it up. But at least it'll provide a little stability, a little consistency. You're going to get a real show every Thursday and every Saturday. Handful of things that we're going to talk about today. I want to speak about Carson Wentz, and obviously we're talking a couple days since the Sunday playoff game. Carson Wentz getting hurt, the Seahawks end up winning. We're going to talk about the difference between snake bitten and injury prone, and I know that was a hot topic, but we'll break that down the best way that I can. The NHL. One of the things that frustrates me is you tell me a team is, certain amount of wins, certain amount of losses, and then a certain amount of overtime losses or shootout losses. I'll tell you how I feel about that in a little bit. But what I really wanted to talk about, you hear in sports and baseball, especially, because for some reason fans look at baseball as being the most pure sport out there. And because of that, the word cheating gets brought up so often. And what I want to do is I want to clarify really who has the right to be cheated. Because we talk about cheating as it comes out, it almost sounds like that little kid that's played a board game and he doesn't win. And he says, "You cheated." That's what it sounds like. So now we're talking about grown adults who actually sound like little kids claiming that somebody cheated. For years now, we've been hearing about performance-enhancing drugs and the use of steroids in baseball and players that should be either blackballed or kept out of the Hall of Fame, or their numbers and accomplishments should have an asterisk next to them because they quote-unquote cheated. The first thing I want to talk about when it comes to cheating is who exactly has the right to feel cheated. And your average everyday sports fan, John Q. Twitter follower, does not have the right to feel cheated when it comes to players using performance-enhancing drugs. You know who has the right to feel like they were cheated? The players that didn't get to the major leagues because other players made it that were using performance-enhancing drugs. And because baseball did such a terrible job in officiating who was using drugs and who wasn't, and the Players Association waiting forever to agree on a drug testing policy, you have so many players that played that either used steroids or didn't use steroids, and you don't know. And I don't know. Anybody that's an expert doesn't know. There's circumstantial evidence that exists that some players probably used. Roger Clemens, even though he was not found guilty in a perjury trial for lying to Congress, probably used performance-enhancing drugs. Barry Bonds probably used performance-enhancing drugs to basically respond to Mark McGwire and Sammy Sosa, who were grabbing all the attention when Bonds felt like he was a better offensive player. And he was. But what about the pitchers? What about those that use performance-enhancing drugs that you don't know anything about because their accomplishments don't matter? That guy that hit 250 in 4 seasons in the big leagues with 200-something at-bats, and his name isn't even relevant, that used performance-enhancing drugs, admits to using performance-enhancing drugs, but nobody cares that that player used performance-enhancing drugs because their stats are irrelevant. It may have made him better, but didn't make him an all-time great. And from the fans, and listen, fans is always going to be the short form of the word fanatic. And fans are passionate, are going to throw their opinions out there. And you know what? Some of them are cold takes, and they really are. When we talk about cheating, and that poor fan that feels like he's cheated because his favorite team didn't win a World Series because another team was using a camera to steal signs or using the replay review camera to steal signs. Sounds like a sore loser. And I don't care if you're an anti-Astros fan, I don't care if you're an anti-Red Sox fan or an anti-Yankees fan. All three of these teams have come up in investigations, and at least there is, some evidence in the Astros case and some smoke when it comes to the Red Sox and the Yankees that teams are using the replay camera to steal signs. And you talk about written rules in baseball, and there is, whether you want to admit it or not, no rule that says specifically that you're not allowed to look at the catcher when he's putting down a sign from second base. That if you can dictate the third base coach signs that he's given to the batter or the base runners, that you're not allowed to use them to your advantage. There's no rule that stipulates that. Now, when it comes to, if you remember the incident with the New England Patriots a handful of years ago, and once again, I'm never going to use the suffix GATE because it doesn't exist, but there obviously was evidence that the Patriots were using cameras and videotaping the sidelines of their opponents, which gave them an advantage, and that was against the rules. Now, what we've heard, obviously, with the Astros, are they using different cameras to be able to specifically see what the catcher is putting down and relaying those signs to the batter, which is against the rules. But the question that I have for you is, what exactly do you expect to happen from this situation? Do you expect the Astros to have a World Series championship vacated? Do you expect the Boston Red Sox to have a World Series championship vacated? If it's determined that the New York Yankees were stealing signs in a 2015 wild card game, are we going to start reversing results like we do in college sports? Because that would actually make more of a mockery of baseball than it already is right now, and would put the mockery that exists in baseball amongst that within any other sport that we could talk about. So nobody's taking away championships. Nobody's taking away how far a team made because they stole signs. That's never going to happen. So all it leaves, once again, my original point, is animosity amongst fans. And fans that are upset and are pulling cards out, whatever they say. They don't like that their team lost, and they want to find a good reason that they lost. They're done blaming the manager because they've listened to the Past Ball Show, and John Pielli has told you 100 times that a manager in baseball is not as impactful as the manager used to be. So you're looking for some reason to feel good that your team didn't win last year. And you say, oh, well, the other team cheated. How about the fact that your team that you rooted for was just not good enough? We don't want to do that. We can't blame the manager, which I'm telling you, there's no reason to blame the manager. You sound like a person that's out of touch with the game of baseball if you think that the manager is responsible for anything other than the culture in the clubhouse, patting the players on the back and making them feel good about themselves, and implementing a game plan that's passed to them from the analytics staff and the front office. Manager doesn't have any more responsibilities than that. I don't care how good a manager may want to feel about themselves. They don't have any more responsibility than that. So once again, we get to the point where you talk about, well, why did our favorite team lose? Why did the Yankees not make it to the World Series last year? It must have been because the Astros cheated. And then, with all due respect to anybody that's a Yankees fan that feels that way, you come across like you're a sore loser. You come across like that kid that's playing that card game or that board game and they didn't win. Oh, you cheated. You must have cheated. That's what you sound like. You sound like a damn fool. It's copyright and broadcast authorized under internet rights granted by the World Wide Web and is solely for entertainment of our audience. Any publication, reproduction, other use of the pictures, descriptions, and accounts of this show without the express written consent of the Passball Show, JohnPLA.com, and John PLA LLC. It is prohibited. Any commercial or use of the program, such as by charge it, admission for its showing is similarly prohibited. So the Eagles in a tough situation this past Sunday for the first time in 3 years, are in the playoffs, don't have Nick Foles on their roster. And of course, a couple years back when the Eagles won the Super Bowl, Carson Wentz was having his best year. And you can make a case that he was probably in the top 2 or 3. You could have made a case if he had not gotten hurt that he could have won the league's MVP that year. He was that good. Nick Foles took over. And it's not like Nick Foles was great. Nick Foles game managed, took the Eagles into the playoffs, helped them win a couple games. Nick Foles' best performance was the Super Bowl against New England. That was his showstopper moment. That was when he pretty much was hovering over his own body watching himself play. He was that good. And obviously wins the Super Bowl MVP. The Eagles win their first Super Bowl in the Super Bowl era. Their first championship since what, the 1950s? The NFL championship, which I think I could dig it up. I should have the stats here. Eagles last NFL championship, 1960. So big deal that the Eagles won themselves a Super Bowl. And of course, calendar year goes by, you jump in the DeLorean, and Carson Wentz gets hurt at the end of the season again. And it's Nick Foles leading the Philadelphia Eagles to a playoff win against the Chicago Bears. And obviously, within the media of the city of Philadelphia, there's this discussion. Who should be the quarterback going forward? Should it be Carson Wentz? Should it be Nick Foles? Carson Wentz, from a talent standpoint, probably has more ability, probably has a chance to be, that Pro Bowl or All-Pro type of quarterback. Nick Foles, a good game manager, has helped the Eagles win some big games, may just have that ability. When it comes down to it, could just win the big game. So the Eagles this year move on from Nick Foles. He signs with Jacksonville, gets paid. Of course, Foles ironically gets hurt. You see Minshew mania. Gardner Minshew, maybe the quarterback there for the future. We'll see where Nick Foles ends up next year, if he goes back to Jacksonville or not. But Carson Wentz, is in a situation where now the Eagles are his team. And with that is going to come the extra pressure from the Philadelphia media, and probably in some cases fans, that are going to say, listen, Carson Wentz has been the starting quarterback for this team since he was drafted number 2 overall a couple years back, or was it 4 years back, 5 years back? And now it's his team or bust. There's no Nick Foles to bail him out. And obviously you saw with the Seattle game this past Sunday, Carson Wentz, an unfortunate injury where he lands on his head. Jadeveon Clowney lands on his head. He ends up leaving, concussion protocol. Independent doctors looking at him, says, listen, there's no way he could come back in this game. And that's unfortunate. You talk about a head injury as it applies to the world of sports. Talk about any head injury that one may have. I've had my share of head injuries. And it's not a joke. The different things that could happen to you, both short-term and long-term. It's very important to make sure that if there's any risk with somebody having a head injury, that person is kept away and be able to rehab themselves and get their mind back. If your brain is jarred a little bit, like it hasn't been jarred before, you want it to be able to reset itself. So there really was no legitimate explanation of why Carson Wentz could come back into the game. Now that's all understood, but obviously you have the backdrop of what happened 2 years ago when Wentz got hurt, ends up missing the playoffs. Nick Foles leads the team to the Super Bowl. Wentz getting hurt at the end of last year. And now you're talking about 3 straight years in the postseason. Carson Wentz's ability to play these big games, which the Eagles have earned their right to get to the postseason, he's not been able to help them. Do you look at Carson Wentz as injury prone? I think next season is going to tell a lot about whether that last statement I just made was true. Now you throw a head injury in there, and I think we do want to be, it's very important to be understanding that a brain injury is a serious thing. And it could very well separate itself from any other injury that you suffer in the world of sports. Somebody getting hit in the head, whether it's John Roseborough with a bat, whether it's Mason Rudolph with a helmet, you understand that is the most serious injury, or one of the most serious injuries that you could suffer on the football field. Maybe or a sports field. Maybe the most harmful injury you could suffer that's short of death. So you do have to look at brain injuries or concussions and treat them differently than you do a rolled ankle or a torn ACL. Now, I understand there's a little back and forth, and you could say, hey, 3 straight years Carson Wentz has gotten hurt, so he must be injury prone. I'm going to hold off on that declaration for at least another year. And you could say some players are just unlucky. And you've looked at great players that have played both in the NFL and Major League Baseball and basketball and hockey. And you talk about some of them that just can't get out of their own way. It's one injury after another. One injury leads to other injuries. And obviously, the more different or separate injuries that you suffer as an athlete, the more possibility exists that time's going to go by and there's going to be lingering injuries that come off of the other injuries. But a brain injury is serious. And anybody that questioned Carson Wentz coming off the field in that football game, the playoff game against the Seattle Seahawks, you may need to get your own head examined. Because there was no reason for Carson Wentz to play in that game. And of course, Josh McCown comes out there, gives the best performance he possibly can against a good Seattle team. A Seattle team that could have beaten the Eagles with Wentz, and a team at full strength. So you understand that Carson Wentz could not compete at that level, but I'm holding off on my opinion as far as declaring Carson Wentz injury prone until at least next year. Because if he starts to have lingering effects of some of these other injuries, the knee, the ankle, the leg, you start to see other variations of the same injuries that we've seen in the past. That is absolutely the definition of injury prone. You want to talk about some guy landing on his head, which Carson Wentz did, whether it was forced, whether it's just an action in football, whether it was intentional, unintentional, advertent, inadvertent. The guy landed on his head. His brain was jarred. That's a separate injury from any other injury that you have in football. And I do think it's worthy to think of Carson Wentz and say, listen, he may be more snake-bitten than injury-prone at this point. And you think about snake-bitten, you think of the New Orleans Saints. Lost a tough game to the Minnesota Vikings for the second time in 3 years. The Minnesota Vikings eliminating the New Orleans Saints. Saints, of course, lost on a pass interference call in the NFC Championship game last year. The year before, of course, on that Hail Mary pass. Not necessarily a Hail Mary pass, but the guy going for the interception, and Stephon Diggs catches it, and there's no safety. There's no deep zone coverage. He's going down the field for a touchdown to win the game for the Minnesota Vikings. So you think of snake bitten, you certainly think of the New Orleans Saints, team that could have been the best team in the NFC the last 3 years, could have represented the National Football Conference in the Super Bowl each of the last 3 years, including this year, and will not be doing that. Carson Wentz, is he more snake bitten or injury prone? I'll pop that up on my Twitter account. We'll see if we can get a poll going. Injury prone, snake bitten. This is the famous Budweiser beer. We know no brand produced by any other brewer that costs so much to brew and age. Our exclusive Beechwood aging produces a taste of smoothness and drinkability. You'll find it no beer at any cost. So, sometimes I end up talking about stuff that may be a little mundane, may not be that big of a deal, may not be, those hard-hitting sports topics. But I was thinking about this the other day. You look at the standings in the National Hockey League, and it's been like this for a while. In fact, it's been like this since, 2005? Since the shootout days. Team's record is how many wins they have, how many losses they have, and how many overtime losses they have. And the most concrete thing I could say about this is What's the difference between a loss and an overtime loss? Yes, that team gets 1 point for the overtime loss. And I do think it's valuable to say, all right, that team is getting a point. They made it to the end of regulation, which we know if you finish 60 minutes in a tie in hockey, both teams are coming out with 1 point. And those points are valuable. Those points sometimes are the difference between a team making the playoffs and not making the playoffs. Those points are the difference between teams getting certain seeds in their respective conferences. So that all I get. It should be acknowledged how many games went to overtime, tied, resulting in both teams getting a point. But losses and overtime losses, in my opinion, should be put together. That team that hypothetically is 26-15-5 is really 26-20. Now you can still put in parentheses or in another column how many overtime losses you have. But I do think it takes away from how good or how bad a team is, because it always looks like the team's record is better than it really was. That team that is 20-21-11 is really 20-32. They're really 12 games under 500, even though their record will say that they're only a game under 500. And of course, you think about ties as they existed in the National Hockey League from 1942 to 1983. 60 minutes once the game was over, or resulted in a game being over. It was a tie. There was no overtime. 1983 to 1988, you started to have 10-minute overtime periods. Then after that, the ties went away. And all of a sudden it was losses, overtime losses, shootout losses, since the shootout started in 2005. Since 1995, of course, teams have been rewarded with a point for coming out of regulation in a tie. So I get it. I understand it's within the confines of the rules, and you want to make sure that you know, as a hockey fan, how many overtime losses your favorite team has, because those points add up over the course of the season. But we are diminishing teams' records. That team that is 36-18-6 is really 36-14 or 38-14. I forgot what records I said or what my example was, but obviously hypothetically, a team that's 40-20-10 is really 40-30. That team that is 20-40-10 is really 20-50. So when we're evaluating teams, that team that may have a 500 record, that may be 20-20, but have 12 overtime losses, is really 20-32. And I hate talking in layman's terms, but to me, it just diminishes the record that a team has. It always makes a hockey team look like they have a better record than they really do. A little bit of a recap of the past ball show, and also a reminder, of course, the program is brought to you by Two Ways, One Passion Food Truck, located in Scranton, Pennsylvania, by JohnPielli.com, and also by St. Aloysius Church and School in Jackson, New Jersey. We're talking about cheating. We're talking about sore losers. As really it applies to fans. It applies to John Q, Twitter handle guy. It just makes you feel better as a fan to claim that somebody cheated. Nobody's taken away any World Series championships, whether it's from the Astros or the Red Sox or the Yankees. We know about more fire existing with the Astros, but the smoke is in the air. Did the Red Sox cheat? Did they cheat with the Apple Watches? What is the difference between cheating and not cheating? You talk about gamesmanship as it applies to baseball. Gamesmanship has existed for years. Players have done everything they can to get a competitive advantage, whether it's sign stealing, whether it's amphetamines, whether it's the use of steroids, whether it's a corked bat. The player's using a corked bat and nobody notices. How many home runs have been hit with a corked bat before? Gaylord Perry, foreign substance on the balls. How much did he get away with it? How many times did other pitchers get away with it? The use of the spitball, which was okay for a while. And then after a time in baseball was abolished, it wasn't allowed. So how you can compare different eras. The pitcher that used the spitball might have been the best pitcher ever to throw the spitball. But now the spitball is abolished, so you can't compare somebody that uses a spitball legally and a spitball illegally. You talk about the times in baseball now where players are not allowed to use amphetamines. And I understand that there is a difference between amphetamines and steroids. Steroids give you more of a performance advantage, but amphetamines are banned from the sport. If you don't have a medical license for ADHD from a doctor, a prescription, you're not allowed to use amphetamines. So if you're caught using amphetamines, you're going to get suspended. If your name is out there as a amphetamine user, it could result in you not getting credit or respect enough when it comes to baseball's Hall of Fame. Didn't in the days of Hank Aaron, didn't in the days of Ted Williams, all the different players that played during the time where amphetamines were legal are not getting punished for using what they used. Any player that used steroids hypothetically in the 1970s or 1980s or even in the 1990s that we just don't know their name may have gotten a free pass to the Hall of Fame. Now, if you find out that somebody that's in the Hall of Fame used steroids, which I'm pretty sure there is there going to be a campaign to get that player out? The answer is no. You're going to see some blowhard that's going to speak about it, but it doesn't mean that there's a chance in hell of that happening. So when we talk about cheating seems like a cry for help. Cheating seems like something that a sore loser says because they hate the fact that they lost. Cheating applies mostly and almost solely to those that were impacted by the cheating. Not John Q, Twitter fan. Not that person that's on the outside looking in that has nothing to do with the sports. All they do is root for the sports. All they do is report on the sports. Cheating impacts the players. So if I want to hear a case from a player that doesn't like the fact that signs were stolen and they didn't feel like the game was played on the same level, that player that played the Will Clarks of the world, that played against Rafael Palmeiro and Mark McGuire, and hated the fact that those guys were on steroids and he wasn't, I care about what that person thinks. I don't care what John Q Twitter handle says. I really don't. Your opinion is irrelevant. You sound like a sore loser. Spoke a little bit about Carson Wentz. Is he snake bitten? Is he injury prone? It's interesting. I think it's a good argument to have. Wentz obviously not part of the Philadelphia Eagles postseason the last 3 years. First two with Nick Foles this past year. Josh McCown gets a chance to quarterback the team. Got to talk about the head injury, though, because that's serious. It's different from, a twisted ankle. It's different from a broken bone. It's different from an ACL. An ACL, you could say, hey, it could be a non-contact injury, but hey, when your knee goes, your knee goes. Your Achilles, sometimes it just goes on you. Sometimes there's nothing you could do to avoid certain injuries. That could make you injury prone. But I think we'll get a better idea this year. There's going to be a lot of pressure on Carson Wentz in the 2020 pro football season with the Eagles. Not just to perform, but to stay healthy, stay on the field. And he has another injury. Let's say he's one of the quarterbacks next year, ends up missing the majority or the entire National Football League season. Those injury-prone takes are going to look a lot more true. They're going to be clarified a little bit. You're going to start to judge Carson Wentz as an injury-prone player. But if he can get through this concussion, hopefully, works out. Hopefully his brain's okay. Got jarred a little bit. Concussions can be very serious. And I say all along, those that like to joke about head injuries or dismiss head injuries likely have never had one before. And I pray that you, the person that doesn't understand the impact of head injuries, never has to deal with one. Once again, concussions are very serious. They linger with you for a long time. They impact your way of life. They have headaches. There's memory loss, but different kind of memory loss. Not like, you're getting old memory loss. Losing your train of thought when you don't normally do that. Having a throbbing headache towards the front of your head that is stronger than your average headache. It's the one that's just basically, you want to do anything you can to shut the switch off. A lot of people don't understand that. And thank God you don't understand that, because I would never wish to my worst enemy that they deal with the effects of post-concussion syndrome. And you hope it's just a minor head injury, a minor concussion, something that Carson Wentz is able to get through. And if that's the case, he'll make a full recovery before the next pro football season, training camp, the next calendar year of 2020 in the National Football League. If Carson Wentz is healthy, it's up to him to find some way to stay that way through this entire next season and get to the playoffs, because the Eagles have a roster that is good enough to make it to the playoffs next year. And unless they decide to sell off players, which I don't think Howie Roseman's going to do that, I don't think Jeffrey Lurie is going to allow that to happen, they're going to return a pretty good roster once again. So Carson Wentz is going to be expected to take that team to the playoffs, and then we'll judge him as a postseason quarterback for the first time. Because you can't judge him off of what? Couple quarter and a half that you saw against Seattle? We don't know what Carson Wentz is as a postseason quarterback, because he hasn't really played in a postseason game. Last thing we spoke about today, National Hockey League, and like I said, it could be considered a mundane point. And we understand, all the information's there. You know how many wins a team has, how many losses a team has, how many overtime or shootout losses a team has. But I think it's time that you take the losses and the shootout losses, combine those totals, so you get a real indication of what a team's win-loss record is. Now, those shootout losses or the overtime losses are important because it results in the losing team getting a point. So I think you do need to quantify that. Hey, if it's 7 or 9 or 11, or you get 20 of them over the course of a National Hockey League season, they add up. That could be the difference, like I said, between a team getting in the playoffs and not getting in the playoffs. A team winning a division and not winning a division. A team getting a certain seed over a team that ends up with a lesser seed. I get that. But we need to combine, or I think they should combine, losses and overtime losses, so you get a better understanding of how good a team is. A coach may save his job because his team is 20-20, but they really have 10 overtime losses, so they're really 20-30. That team that looks like they're 30-4, but they have 20 overtime losses, is really 30-24. And like I said, I'm not breaking any news with this. I think anybody that follows hockey, anybody that is a hockey fan understands this. But I also think it's making hockey teams' win-loss records look better than they really are. To finish off the show today, we're going to catch up with some trivia. I've actually failed in my last 2 questions when it comes to my baseball trivia. So let's talk about some positives. First one, the question was, name the Hall of Famer that's in the 500 home run club who never hit 40 home runs in a season. And the choices for that were Ted Williams, Eddie Murray, Mel Ott, and Frank Thomas. My answer was Eddie Murray, and I was correct, which put me 5 for 5 this year when it comes to baseball trivia. Now the bad news. Next question was, name the 2 National League hitters who led the league in runs batted in 3 or more times in the 1970s. So it was 2 out of 5, and the choices were Johnny Bench, George Foster, Greg Lazinski, Willie Stargell, Willie McCovey. To me, Johnny Bench was a definite answer. I felt good about that one. The other one I wasn't sure about. I know George Foster had won it at least twice. Greg Luzinski was a possibility, but I didn't think so. Willie Stargell was very good in the decade of the 1970s. Willie McCovey was kind of towards the second part of his career, was not as much of a feared force in the decade of the 1970s, was better in the 60s than he was in the 70s, even though he's good. Obviously, a Hall of Famer, stretched the whole thing. So my answer was Bench and Stargell, and I was wrong. It turns out it was Bench and Foster. So Foster had led the National League in RBIs a third season in the 1970s. It was Bench in 70, 72, 74, and Foster had won it 3 straight times from 76 to 78, or led the league 3 straight times. So the next one, which of the following right-hand batters did not win 3 or more batting titles? And this was a good one. You look at the choices: Hank Aaron, Napoleon Lajoie, Roberto Clemente, Rogers Hornsby, Miguel Cabrera. So right off the bat, I identified 3 players that I knew won 3 or more batting titles: Lajoie, Hornsby, Cabrera. So I crossed them off. So I knew it was either going to be Hank Aaron or Roberto Clemente. And I went with Clemente, and the answer was Aaron. So Aaron won 2 batting titles at 56 and 59. That leaves me for the record for the season at 5 out of 7, which is below that 90% that I'm expecting when it comes to baseball trivia this year. Now, I told you right off the bat that the Mets questions are a lot harder than I thought they would be. And we'll start with the January 7th question, which was, who was the first 2 managers in Mets history to lead the team to consecutive postseason appearances? To me, that was an easy answer. Bobby Valentine, Terry Collins. So I got that one right. That puts me at 3 out of 4 for the season. Next question. Now, there's a lot of facts in here, too. So January 9th question, which was yesterday. Can you name the first 4 pitchers in Mets history to win 8 consecutive games? Now, just like the Tom Seaver lead the National League in strikeout seasons, listen, the diehardest of diehardest Mets fans may not know the answer to that question. So I did the best I could. I admit for the second time since we've started this trivia that I gave you an educated guess. I went Gooden, Seaver, Jerry Koosman, and R.A. Dickey. I only got one of those 4 right. Seaver. Next were David Cone, Bobby Jones, and Jacob deGrom. It's pretty interesting. Not doing so good with the Mets trivia. 3 out of 5 so far. Baseball trivia sitting there at 5 out of 7. We're going to be back with you this coming Saturday. We'll do a little preview of the National Football League playoffs. And, I've heard it said before, and I do agree, one of the better weekends in the National Football League season. You got the 4 games, but you pretty much know that the 8 teams that are playing this weekend are really the best 8 teams in the National Football League. Sure, somebody may have gotten knocked off, whether you're a Pats fan, a Saints fan. You say, hey, maybe one of those teams belonged in there and didn't make it this year, but it's probably the time where you're going to see the best football. So we'll do some previews. We'll see if we can do better than we did in our picks last week. Baseball, you obviously got still some free agency going on. I'm concerned to see whether the Pirates decide to trade Starling Marte. I think new general manager Ben Sherrington with the Pirates is going to look to use Marte as a very good trade chip. So he's looking to get the best package possible. Are the Mets still in the mix? Are the Rangers in the mix? The Rangers look like they're going to make a big splash. Do they end up getting Josh Donaldson? Did the Dodgers end up getting Donaldson? Is Nolan Arenado still a possibility to be had in a trade? It looks like the talks about Chris Bryant have kind of, passed themselves aside. So still a lot of action that you'll see in baseball. And even though teams did a better job signing free agents this year, there's still a lot of odds and ends that need to be clarified. You got obviously the national championship game, which will be this coming Monday, Clemson, LSU. We'll see if Clemson can make a game of it. Be nice to see them win a 3rd championship in their last, 5 or 6 years. LSU looks like the best team. Maybe talk a little bit basketball on Saturday, too. Once again, this is the Pass Ball Show, brought to you by Two Ways, One Passion Food Truck, located in Scranton, Pennsylvania, by St. Aloysius Church and School in Jackson, New Jersey, and by johnple.com. God bless you, and as always, I'll see you on the other side.